Welcome back. Hope you had a nice morning tea break. Welcome to the next session, which is titled The Future of Reputation Intelligence. In our new network media ecosystem, reputation is one of the most important factors in predicting the success or demise of politicians, celebrities, organizations, or corporations. Reputations can be measured pretty well in the traditional world of media, but it's not quite the same in the connected, fast-moving, always-on world. In this sponsored session from Isentia, CEO and founder of Pulsar, Francesco D'Orazio, will take you through how the power of vertical AI, live audience segmentation, and real-time discourse clustering can identify the stories that shape public opinion, predict the impact of reputational shifts, and provide a data-driven steer to key decisions in comms and marketing. Please join me in welcoming Fran. Going on that.
That's my better side. Thanks for the intro, Callum, and good morning, everyone. And sorry for the really boring blurb I gave Callum. I was boring myself as I was listening to the intro, so I hope it's going to be slightly more entertaining than that. So my name is Francesco. I am pretty jet-lagged. I just landed on Monday, first time in Australia, first time in Sydney. It's pretty amazing, but I'm a little bit confused. So I might not make completely sense as I take you through this. So this is me. I've kind of like, this is what I've been doing for the last 2 years. Lockdown, entertaining my daughter at home. I've got really good at the art of levitation. As you can see, I've perfected the skill. She loves it, and but I'm kind of like, I'm happy to be back on the kind of like on a plane, jet-lagged in another country, doing a couple of talks, and it's amazing to be in Australia. I'm swimming every morning in Bondi, so it's pretty amazing. Yeah, great to see you guys, and great to meet loads of people that I've never met before. Pulsar, if you haven't heard before. So first of all, thanks to Isentia for inviting me to be here today with you guys. Isentia is our sister company, or rather, we are the sister company of Isentia. We're part of the same group. We've both kind of like, we have the same destiny. We've both been acquired by the same public company, and we now kind of like offer two complementary propositions. Isentia looks at how, Isentia, you know Isentia, but in terms of like how it's positioned towards us or against us, Isentia looks at how the media represents or kind of like plays back the brands, and we look at how audiences are playing back brands. So it's kind of like two sides of the same coin in a way. To describe what we do in a kind of like a couple of sentences, we combine a bunch of conversational and behavioral data with vertical AI, and I'll explain what that is, to help organizations create messages that are relevant to the audiences that they're trying to reach. We use 4 types of signals. We use media data, we use social data, we use search data, and we use a lot of first-party data to try and understand what we call the attention trail. So how the attention of the audience is kind of like moving through different stages. We generally look at the media data and the social data as catalysts that are like attracting attention around the topic, and they introduce a new subject or something that is happening that people pay attention to, but it's generally an upstream audience that is paying attention to that. And then we use search data to understand when their attention is kind of like migrating to the mainstream audience. So you've seen 3 years ago TikTok in the news, then you will go and search for TikTok and go like, what the hell is this? And then we'll see that signal in the search data that we're analyzing and understand that TikTok is going mainstream. And then we look at how in your first-party data, survey data, or Google Analytics or your own website, how that is translating into your own audience behaving differently because they've seen this bunch of things online. So when we try and wrap it all together, we kind of like follow 2 principles that are quite important for us. The first one is that brand watching lags, and we love to make this pun as much as we can. We say that brand watching lags because not 1% of the people that follow a brand online actually talk about that brand. So when you're looking at just mentions of a brand, right, and using this data for understanding what the audience cares about and what, like, you know, how, like, what the kind of like the interest profile of their audience and how they behave, you're actually really looking at a really small section of what you could be looking at. So for us, it's always really important to widen the scope of what you're looking at and try and understand an audience in a broader sense. And then the second one is that perceptions and behaviors actually anticipate. So you should be looking at how people perceive things, how people behave, how people kind of like demonstrate attitudes towards larger topics to really understand what your audience cares about, rather than just looking at how they're specifically talking about your brand. Having said that, this talk is about reputation intelligence, so we'll be looking at a lot of those conversations. So when you think of like social listening, which is kind of like the old way of defining what we do, this is what normally people think about. They think about dashboards, they think about monitoring brands, they think about sentiment. And this talk is really about trying to demolish any faith you might have in sentiment and in sentiment analysis, and show you that there's a better way of doing things and understanding audiences beyond a simple positive, negative, neutral stamp on a piece of content. And what we do instead of that is analyzing conversations and understanding signals about emotion, behaviors, intent to buy, consumer journey, and then mapping that onto an audience analysis that helps us understanding who is the audience behind some of these behaviors and how we can segment those audiences to understand the nuances within an audience rather than just considering audiences like a monolith. And then connecting all of that to what brands are already running as primary research, because it doesn't make any sense to have this information in a silo, completely separated from, I don't know, a brand tracker that a brand has been running for like years before they even thought about social media. So on to the topic of today. When you look at social reputation, if you look at it from a human standpoint, what that basically refers to is the global impression that individuals within a community hold regarding a particular target individual within that community. And if you think of social reputation, you can actually position it on a continuum that ranges from the selfish side, bad reputation, and the kind of like other-oriented side, really good reputation, people love you because you love them. From an evolutionary perspective, this is kind of odd, because in evolution, all the traits that in nature tries to reward are the traits that are kind of like quite selfish, the traits that are kind of like preserving your ability to survive, unless you're a man, in which case you kind of like don't follow the same rules. In this sense, reputation has always been a bit of a conundrum from an evolutionary perspective. And what is interesting about it is that you only understand why you need to be other-oriented to succeed in a social context if you think about the fact that humans have evolved over time by persistently and continuously engaging with the same people in relatively small-scale societal environments where they had to gain the trust and the respect and the support of the people within that same specific group before they can do and they can go out and do anything within that group. And what happened with the evolution of media in the last 100 years is that we recreated that kind of environment in the media, where electric media, so TV and radio, and then digital media in the last 30 years have really recreated this kind of like small-scale environment on a global scale. So effectively what's happening to brand and corporate reputation is that these rules of kind of like having to be other-oriented and having to be in touch with the same persistent contacts that you need to gain respect and trust from have kind of like become like something really crucial for brands to survive today. And so we kind of like, over the last 15 years, we've been moving from an inward-looking idea of reputation intelligence and reputation management, where you've kind of like been on the defense and always try and kind of like look out for threats and look at responding to threats, and kind of like moving into an outward-looking idea of reputation, which is what's been happening with the whole idea of like CSR and ESG and all the kind of like ideas around how do we proactively build reputation for brands to be relevant within a certain community, which effectively has become a lot more kind of like a branding exercise than just a reputation management exercise, which makes this job really interesting. And but we've been doing a really bad job at analyzing reputation in a kind of like online environment. And we've been doing a bad job because we're still kind of like obsessed with this idea of sentiment and this idea of kind of like simply looking at whether people are having a positive or a negative reaction to something that a brand does. And this is kind of like one of the very first examples of like sentiment analysis or reputation intelligence is Agamemnon, the guy that was like doing the siege of Troy. And after 9 years of doing that siege, he was like, all right, guys, we've got to attack these guys and we need to kick them out. What are we going to do? So he was trying to understand where the soldiers were at. And he obviously didn't have pulsar, so he couldn't figure out sentiment for the troops. So what he did was a little behavioral experiment. And he went like, he told them the opposite of what he was going to do. He told them like, you know what? Let's sack this off. Let's go home. After 9 years, it's been enough. Go home to your wives and your kids. And to his surprise, instead of like going like, no, you're crazy, we should go and take Troy, everybody packed their bags and went to the ships. And so he understood that it wasn't really kind of like going to fly the way he thought it was going to fly. Fast forward a couple of thousand years, 3,000 actually. This is like Hadley Cantrill was the guy that pretty much invented the studies of public opinion. And in kind of like in the 40s, when mass media and propaganda started to drive, the agendas and what kind of like politicians do and what armies kind of like are going to do off the back of what politicians decide to do, he kind of like start creating a bit of a science around public opinion and understanding how public opinion can be monitored, how it can be used to shape policy, how it can be used to manipulate the masses. This is the same with his kid in Princeton. Country on the left, his kid on the right, using this kind of like perception room to show how effectively, this is fake news 50 years ago, 70 years ago, how public opinion can be manipulated and how simple measurements of reputation and sentiment can actually lead to that kind of manipulation. And when he left Princeton, he went on to found an institute of research in the 60s where he was studying the connection between international tensions and how war break out. And one of the interesting surveys that he ran was the survey trying to understand Cuban people and whether they really cared about Fidel Castro. And what his study showed is that people had this really deep emotional attachment to Fidel Castro and his views of the world. And he kind of like didn't manage to pass the results of that study in time to JFK. And so JFK went and did the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and obviously failed. And, it didn't really kind of like go according to plan. And this is one of the kind of like first big failures of audience intelligence, failures of understanding reputation, failures of understanding sentiment. And you might think that if at that point in time they had, social media, they could have got a sense that Cubans were really into Fidel Castro and it probably was a really bad idea to invade the Bay of Pigs. But not so much, because 60 years later, when this guy in 2013 go on stage in London and he kind of like promises his rightist wing side of the Tory electorate that he was going to do a referendum, he's banking on the fact that people don't want to leave Europe. And he's thinking like, this is going to be an easy promise to maintain. I'm going to do a referendum and I'm going to get away with it. And this is like after a couple of years, he wins the election, but after like not even 9 months after that, he's out because he loses the referendum. So another kind of like big failure of political intelligence, and I always like to call him out on this because it's fun. But brands have been kind of like paying the price for these mistakes since a very long time. One of the biggest one that happened in kind of like modern days was like Coke in 1985. Where in the 80s there was, during the whole kind of like Jane Fonda fitness tape era, which I'm probably starting to be the oldest one in the room, so maybe a lot of you don't even know what that is. But in those days, sugar cola drinks kind of like started to go down in sales. And so Coke, after 100 years, was kind of like shifting Coke drinks. And they thought like, you know what, maybe we got to change the formula. Maybe it's something to do with the taste. And so they created this new formula for Coke. They tested it, and it tested positive with the people that they were testing with. And in 1985, in April, they decided, like, let's go for it. And so they replaced Coke with a new kind of like Coke formula, and it was a disaster. People were in the street protesting, banners, call centers, and everything. And what they failed to understand was that, yes, the new flavor might taste positive, but actually there's a deep emotional connection to the brand and to the product that goes beyond a positive or negative kind of like reaction that you might have picked up from an analysis of what are people saying about the flavor that we're launching now. And effectively, from that day on, what we've seen in the last 30 years is an acceleration of those kind of crises. And this is a useful map to see the amount of PR crises that have happened from, for example, 2004, from one of the kind of like first PR, well, pretty much the biggest first PR crisis was of the social media age was kryptonite. A guy in New York, well, you know what kryptonite is, right? The kind of like buy clock brand. And a guy in New York figures out a way of opening a kryptonite lock with a biro pen. And then he puts it in a video and he shows that he can open the lock, puts that video online in a forum. Facebook had just been launched, but it's not where this happens. Puts it in a forum. Someone at the New York Times sees that forum thread, picks it up, writes an article about it. Kryptonite goes mad. Everybody starts kind of like talking about it. It goes big. It goes in the news programs, and the share price of kryptonite kind of like collapses. And this is the first time that people are really paying attention to, you know, this thing can really damage a brand. It can go big, but we're still in that defensive stage of reputation intelligence. And effectively, from that point on, the more kind of like social channels are added to the mix, the more crises you get every year. And this kind of like continues today, where we have effectively crises every other day. But what is interesting is that with social media, we start having on the web kind of like an invasion of subjective tests. So people that express subjective views about something, in this case, brands. And exactly with the coincidence of that specific influx of new opinions and subjective opinions that people are expressing on the web, you see an explosion of papers on sentiment analysis. This is the amount of papers that have been published on sentiment analysis from 2004 on. Sentiment analysis becomes immediately the main way of analyzing this and making sense of public opinion and reputation online. Over the last kind of like 10 years, it has become the main methodology. There's like 10 different ways of doing sentiment analysis. This is just a really boring chart to show you that. I know that there are 10 ways of doing that, but there are, trust me. And then there's a bunch of kind of like industry where it's been applied. It's pretty much widely accepted anywhere, except that it's a really poor indicator for what's going on. But it has even replaced the subject that it's supposed to cover, which is customer feedback. This is Google searches about sentiment analysis from 2004 to today. Now, a really good example of when sentiment is inadequate to understand what people think of a brand is the gift that keeps on giving from Peloton. You might remember this crisis just before the pandemic started. Do you remember this ad? So Peloton put out an ad where a man gives his wife for Christmas a bike to exercise. So that, but the mom is actually pretty fit and she's doing all right. She doesn't really need to exercise. But it's the whole dynamic between the kind of like husband giving the wife a bike to exercise that immediately sounds really off and really misogynistic, and it just blows up in the face of Peloton, and Peloton loses $1.5 billion in market value in the kind of like following weeks from the release of the ad, actually in the following 3 days. And what's interesting is that at the time, you would have seen a lot of these kind of charts online, useless sentiment analysis charts, analyzing what was happening to the reputation of Peloton, with a lot of negativity that wasn't really negative, and a lot of positivity that wasn't really positive. So kind of like a net sentiment analysis chart that didn't really tell you what happened. And in fact, this is what really happened to Peloton after that kind of like big PR crisis. That's the crisis in December, kind of like in the 2 or 3 weeks after the ad was aired. And this is what the market share of the business and the value of the stock does in the following 12 months. So a 300% growth. And this is not to say that the ad wasn't misogynistic and sexist. It was. And it was really dumb for them to do something like that. But that perception, that analysis of sentiment to understand what the audience actually thought of Peloton wasn't really reflective of what the audience thought in reality, because the audience got totally behind it, probably, well, actually definitely helped by the pandemic, as you've seen from what happened to Peloton in the last few months this year. But the point I'm trying to make is that sentiment is a really dumb way of figure things out. And sentiment is now embedded in stuff like your text messaging. And you will go like, hey, so apparently I tested positive for COVID at work. And then the app would suggest, great, yay, that's great, good. That's actually what my daughter said when she got COVID. She was like, Dad, I'm really happy to have COVID, because she was staying home and she wasn't going to school. But this is what sentiment gets wrong, and there's obviously many reasons why it's technically difficult to make sense of stuff. But you would have thought that in 2022 testing positive doesn't necessarily sound positive, but it still does in the sentiment world. But the problem is not the tech. I think the problem is the question we're asking is wrong. We're trying to simplify the perceptions that people have about a brand, which is a complex entity, with a negative, positive, and neutral kind of like view of that brand, and it's not that simple. And so we're basically asking the wrong questions, and what I'm trying to do with Systtalk is convince you that there's a better way of looking at it. The data that we're getting, where we kind of like get this kind of like signals from the audience, is coming from a bunch of data sources that are pretty messy, pretty noisy, pretty unmoderated. They're always on, they're in real time, but they are measurable. You just need to structure them in the right way. So if you look at a couple of examples of like what people would say online about brands, I wish Amazon had a rent to buy feature for movies. So if you like a film you just rented, you can buy it minus the amount you pay to rent it. Pretty straightforward. Spotify. Why does Spotify keep recommending me to the mood booster playlist? Leave me alone and let me be sad. Fair enough. So if you start breaking this down, you start seeing a new feature idea, a naming suggestion, an explanation of a need state or a use case, a desired outcome and a user flow, a pain point, or an insight for content curation and content strategy. There's a lot packed in here, and reputation is part of the signals that are packed in here. But how do you make sense of this mess? After years of kind of like looking at unstructured data and looking at this volume of stuff that comes at us every day around products, around brands, around topics like climate change and everything, we landed on a concept that is helping us a lot, and we built the whole kind of like set of tools that we use and methodologies around a very simple concept, and that concept is the concept of narratives. There's this book that I really liked recently called Narrative Economics that talks about how narratives shape economic outcomes. And what is interesting about this book is that he has a very simple definition of a narrative, which is a story or a belief that is shared by a group of people. And this is kind of like what we built in Pulsar to make sense of public opinion. We built something that identifies stories and beliefs, and it clusters everything that we're getting from the media and social media in stories and beliefs. And then we do the same job of clustering into audiences to understand audiences that are similar to each other and that held specific beliefs. And the key idea is that different people talk about the same topic or care about the same topic for different reasons. This is applied to TV shows, to brands, to stuff like climate change. Someone that is a financial analyst would have different views on climate change than someone that is an activist, and someone that is a politician, and someone that is a parent. They all care about climate change, but they care about it for very different reasons. And that's the same kind of dynamic that we need to have in mind when we're looking at brands and looking at the reputation that we have of brands. So to make sense of reputation, we use what we call the reputation funnel, which is a 5-step process that we kind of like pass this data through to make sense of it. And obviously, we're collecting this data, we're sampling it so that we're just looking at the stuff that is relevant for analyzing reputation. But then when it starts to get interesting is the weighting bit. So we do 3 levels of kind of like weighting, which is pretty much like no conversation is created equal. Every conversation has a different kind of like impact on the audience, and you need to be able to measure it. So we obviously look at sentiment, but we look at engagement, we look at the intensity of the opinion that is being expressed, and we look at the emotions that we can analyze and we can detect in that expression. Then we look at visibility and credibility. How impactful is this piece of content, and then how credible is this piece of content? I'll get back to those in a second. And then we wrap up all of these into a kind of like a online reputation score that connects all of these dimensions into a number that we can apply to those messages. So for something like visibility, what we do is we take into account the format of a piece of content, the reach of that piece of content, and the engagement, and we pack that into a score that allows us to compare an article on the BBC to a post on Facebook to a post in a forum, so that we stop over-indexing on stuff that is easy to measure, and you can actually get a view across multiple signals. And in terms of credibility, we just partnered recently with NewsGuard that kind of like hires a team of journalists and editors that basically score the outlets that are producing news content in 4 ways. Green for outlets that are like observing the kind of like key criteria for credibility. Red for outlets that are obviously not trustworthy and unlikely to push out misinformation. And then obviously satire websites and platforms where there's no elements of curation. And this is an example of the type of analysis they do on a domain, like it could be, the dailymail.com, or it could be a blog, or it could be a website that is publishing information like Breitbart. And by having this kind of information in the platform, we can always tell what percentage of the news coverage that is affecting a brand is actually coming from outlets that are not trustworthy. And so we're launching in a few weeks a brand misinfo index that effectively tells you what level of threats your brand is exposed to in terms of misinformation, so that you can be aware that there might be content coming from some of these publications that might affect the way your brand is being represented online. And we're doing the same for government departments, which obviously they are a really juicy target for a lot of organizations that are in that misinfo space. And this one is for the UK, and no surprises, but obviously the Home Office is the one that gets bombarded the most by misinformation. And so it will be more kind of like, this will be publicly available and will be something that anybody can access on the web. Having done that weighting bit, then the big kind of like the most interesting part is adding structure to this data. So what we do at this stage is saying, we've got like a bunch of posts that are expressing views. We weighted those posts, so some of them are kind of like bigger than others. Let's say each one of these bubbles is one of those posts, and we're kind of like weighting them so that we know that one is being more impactful than others. And now we're applying a lens on top of it to make sense of it and structure it in buckets to understand what we're looking at. We look at kind of like using AI, which is what we one of the unique things of the platform, which is basically building models that fit specific questions that we have. Like you have a corporate social responsibility question, you have an ESG question, you have a customer experience question. And these models are tailored to specific industries to make sense of that opinion that is being expressed. And this is what we call vertical AI, which is basically, instead of generic AI, this is machine learning that is designed to classify data according to a framework that is specific to a use case, an industry, or a research question that you might have. Let's start from like basic examples of classification. This is one that gets overlooked a lot in terms of reputation intelligence. The visual language that customers express around the brand is the most difficult one to quantify. So if I'm looking at understanding, what's the reputation of Land Rover by looking at 1 million images that people are posting about Land Rover, a really good example is that I would spot that there are like a bunch of kind of like images that contain an animal, a mammal, and a dog. And they tend to be the same image because the software is telling me that this concept appear in the same images consistently. And when I go and look at the images, I see this, or I see this. And what is interesting is that these are narratives. These are like ways of expressing a point of view on a brand that is telling me a story, and I can detect the story if I'm doing the analysis of that content in the right way. And this does have an impact on the reputation of the brand that goes way beyond what any advanced sentiment analysis can tell me. But that kind of like level of analysis and adding structure can take many shapes. So you can analyze the discourse around sustainability over time to identify the benchmarks and see where your brand kind of like lands in terms of like what dimensions of sustainability are being discussed, the most of the least in the last 15 years. This is 15 years of conversations on sustainability. Or if you're launching a kind of like a sustainability strategy for your brand, you might want to look at the associations that are connected to desired and undesired behaviors to understand what threats and opportunities are in there for you. For example, if you go with a concept like carbon, which seems like a pretty obvious concept associated with sustainability, you should be mindful that actually that concept is also associated with greenwashing. So you kind of like setting yourself up for failure if you lead with that idea, because we know that it is associated with things that are considered to be a threat when you're trying to kind of like shape the reputation of the brand in that direction. You can add a framework of service qualities that are associated with a brand. So speed, ease, and price are consistently coming up as the key qualities that people associate with food delivery brands. And it's really easy to compare reputation when you start having a framework that is dictated by how people are behaving. And it's kind of like so obviously kind of like structured. You can do the same with search data. So you can look at what kind of questions that people are asking, what kind of associations that people are asking. Again, this is stuff that a sentiment analysis wouldn't be any use for, but this tells you how people are feeling about a specific category. For example, these are questions about different types of alcohol. So top questions on champagne. Why is champagne expensive? Will champagne freeze? Are champagne and sparkling wine the same? No, they're not. Can champagne go bad? How champagne is made. So these are like the top questions that people have, which again affect the way people see the product and the category. But you can also look at things like how the brand fits into the daily life of the customer. So this is Sonos, and this is an analysis that shows where people mention Sonos in conjunction with what part of the house when they are kind of like using the speakers. Or you can look at what moment of the day is the most crucial for people when they think or mention Sonos. And again, starting the day is the biggest by a mile, and so that's quite interesting in terms of associations and reputation of the brand. Or you can look at what motivators people kind of like think of to use the service. In this case, a top motivator for people to start using Uber at the beginning was how easy it was to transact and make payments. It was the convenience element. Or you can look at the scenarios that are driving positive perceptions and the scenarios that are driving negative perceptions of the service. You can look at how people that are rejecting the product are actually using it to understand what scenarios are driving a positive reputation and what scenarios are driving a negative reputation. Or you can associate, for example, personality traits. So this one is a reputation model just based on what kind of personality, so like human personality traits are people attaching to a brand. And this shows how airlines have got the kind of like the worst out of the pandemic. All their indicators are down in terms of like how they are perceived from the public. When you apply the same model, for example, to academic institutions, you can see that the excitement of going to uni has taken a massive beating since COVID. That's obviously because of all the problems with campuses and how the experience changed after COVID. But then you can wrap all of these into a kind of like superstructure for understanding reputation that looks at all the different dimensions, which is what we use the most, and is a structure by dimensions of reputation. So it's something that allows us to analyze brands in terms of the product and services and how they score on reputation on the front, the technology and innovation they use, how is it to work in these organizations, what kind of governance do they have in place, what kind of citizenship are they showing in respect to their communities, what kind of leadership do they have, and what kind of performance are they kind of like showing. And as you can see, when you analyze brands within the same category, these indicators are pretty consistent. There's almost like the same footprint for the reputation of these brands. And so this makes it really easy to understand what levers you should be pushing. And finally, the kind of like funniest or like the funnest stage, which is the clustering bit that brings it all together. So at this stage, what we're trying to do is we have got all these building blocks in terms of weighting the data, in terms of categorizing it into structures that make sense for understanding reputation. And then you can cluster the stories together. What kind of discourses are we seeing emerging from the data set? What kind of networks are we seeing? How are people connecting to each other and how are they interacting around these narratives? And what kind of types of people are we seeing in the audience? And when you bring this together, you get a model that looks more or less like this. So you're defining the playing field, I don't know, people that talk about brand X or climate change. Then you're segmenting the audience of the people that get involved in that conversation. And then for each one of those audiences, you zoom into the type of stories and beliefs that they held. And then you use that information for deciding how do you manage reputation. So what audiences and stories am I going to focus on? What investment am I going to put onto this narrative versus another narrative? What media do I use to put those stories in market? What audiences am I trying to reach? What stakeholders am I trying to prioritize? And what influencers am I going to prioritize for each one of these audiences that I'm trying to do? Because they're all kind of like different set of influencers and stakeholders depending on the segment that you're looking at. And then finally, what kind of creative am I using in my press releases? What kind of creating am I using in my content strategy? What kind of stories and beliefs am I going after? What kind of like dimensions of reputation need attention? What kind of behaviors am I trying to boost, or am I trying to minimize? What kind of threats can I spot, and what kind of opportunities can I spot? But you're doing it in this narrative structure where you're looking at stories and beliefs and audiences. And it's something that kind of like sounds complicated, but it's actually available in your platform once you structure the data in the right way. So there's a reputation score that tells you whether something on a scale from 0 to 100 fits into the framework that you're trying to measure. There's a view of how that reputation score plays against sentiment, emotion, intensity, and how it changes over time. You can see dimensions of reputation over time and what dimensions of workplace, governance, citizenship, and leadership, for example, are they contributing to the perceptions of the brand? What supportive behaviors are driving reputation that we see in the audience? Are people saying that they would buy or recommend this product? Would they do business with them? Would they work for them? Would they say something positive about them? Would they welcome this brand into the community? Would they trust them to do the right thing, governance? Would they invest or recommend to invest into that brand? And then you can look at how these dimensions of reputation are driving shift in reputation. So you can see in this case of this brand how technology and leadership are playing a really strong role in like improving the reputation of the brand. But you can also see how workplace and governance are actually quite detrimental to the reputation of the brand. So you understand immediately what kind of strategy you should be taking in terms of comms. And you can look at how events also play out against the setup that you have in terms of the dimensions of reputation. You can see how sponsorship conversations maps against the general conversation for the reputation of the brand. And you can look at, and this is like the most interesting one for me when we work with brands, is the understanding of how reputation changes depending on the audience clusters or stakeholders that we're trying to understand. And you can see how uneven it is and how immediately you can point your attention to specific areas that need focus and areas that they don't. But you can also start predicting how reputation will change over time. So for example, we noticed that when a certain reputation kind of like dip happens, if the kind of like content in the media or in social has a higher degree of visibility, it will take longer for that reputation score to go back to the benchmark. And so now we can start anticipating how long is it going to take for us to be able to kind of like fix that dip, and what do we need to do to be able to do that. And finally, use this information to rank reputational risks in industry discussions so that we can have a data-driven view of what needs to be done and when. So to wrap this up, what do we mean by the future of reputation intelligence? Stop focusing on sentiment and focus on narratives. Invest in vertical AI versus generic listening. Kind of like have structured data that helps you make sense of real-time feedback in a kind of like productive way. Have something that allows you, this kind of like structure allows you to have granular understanding of what's happening, but in an immediate way so that you don't invade the Bay of Pigs without the right insight. And structure the data in a way that you can map it against whatever else the brand is already doing, like a very expensive, really slow, years-long brand tracker, because this allows you to understand the why to their what, because you see in this data in real time, and you can kind of like search for this data. You can deep down in this data, and you can try and understand what's behind these movements. And finally, you can finally move from something that used to be retrospective to something that can be predictive and help you map what you're going to do next. And thanks for listening.
Right. Is mine on? I don't think yet. There we go. We've got about 3.5 minutes if anyone wants to get in with a question. Anyone?
Was it that boring? Sorry.
Well, would you like to sit down for a very short 3 minutes? And we
yeah,
can,
let's do that.
I'll grill you. Yeah, so I guess the first thought from me coming out of that was that it was a very kind of stark difference between the early session we had this morning, where it was kind of creative focused. Do you think that PR and comms necessarily has to be more data focused and kind of, I guess, formulaic?
No, I think creative is good. Like the way we see data is as a way of stimulating creativity rather than kind of like replacing with something that is like formulaic. What we're trying to provide with data in the case of creativity is inspiration, and providing something that grounds inspiration not into the guts of the creative that is coming up with the idea, but in the audience. And so what we're kind of like always preaching is being audience driven, be audience first, and learn from the audience, be inspired by the audience rather than just try and push stuff on the audience based on what you think is best. So for me, being data driven simply means look around and learn from the audience.
And I know you kind of spoke there about looking at things from the narrative perspective rather than in the moment. Do you think there will ever be a point where we can get people to look at the wider picture, or is there always going to be sort of knee-jerk reactions when, for example, Peloton?
Yeah, I think knee-jerk reaction is easier because knee-jerk reaction is just like, it's simplifying reality. But in reality, when you see that in terms of consequences, like it's way more complex than the knee-jerk reaction. So effectively, is whether you really want to see and kind of like map out what's going to happen next, or whether you want a simple kind of like story for the moment that is not going to serve you well further down the line. So for us, it's more about trying to give the audience credit and try and recognize that kind of like people know what they're doing. People are not stupid. People buy into these narratives for reasons that are quite deep, and they map into their needs. And so understanding the narratives means understanding the needs of the audience, and if you get those, then you can really connect with them. At the end of the day, the job is connecting with an audience.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're going to move on there, so we have to get to the next session. But before we thank Fran, I know you're probably going to hear it quite a few times today, but jump on that app, give it a rating. It means that next year we can continue to deliver really strong events. But for now, please join me in thanking Fran.
Thanks.
Nice one, mate.
Thanks, mate.
Well done. That was great.
Shall I leave this here?